Poor little mouse. He just wanted a piece of cheese. My name is Jimmy Reyes, and I'm a professional comic book inker. Welcome to my channel, where I share tips, techniques, and an inside look at my inking process.
Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today you may have noticed a different backdrop. Yes, this indoor cat is outside. So today's video is going to be about drawing texture and how we have all the reference that we need right outside in our backyard and inside our home as well. Yes, you could pull up Google Images, but you're not going to provide your brain with the same information that you would if you were to experience these textures in person. So I recommend going outside, touching some of the trees, touching the different rocks, touching metal. This way you store that information inside your brain so that when you sit down inside your studio, and even if you pull up Google Images, you can provide your brain with all the information from the experience you just had touching those textures. So I'm going to show you the way that I have broken down a process for myself when drawing textures. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples.
When you think of textures, I want you to think of a texture as a pattern. It's a sequence of line work, repeated over and over, that creates the illusion of texture. So for the tree stump that I'm drawing, I'm simply doing triangles, lines that are applied over each other, or triangles applied inside of each other, almost like what you would see in an echocardiogram printout. Now I keep my lines rough and jagged by doing almost a quick sort of sketch. And that creates the look of the rough edge, creates that textured look of the tree bark. And the lines that I'm placing in there with thick lines and then thin little lines that have a jagged edge are creating the shadow, the area of the tree bark that has no light to it, where the light is not touching the inner parts that are embossed into the tree. And you can make these lines as thick as you want to show the gap that's in between the tree bark, sort of a canyon where it is pressed into the tree. So the closer and the thicker the lines you make them can create the effect of shadow and shading. And if you notice at the beginning of the video, there was an illustration that popped up on the screen. That illustration had different type of texture on the tree. If you notice, I made the lines go at a bit more of a slanted angle than the straight vertical lines that you see on the example above. So you have the option to create the lines in any direction that you like to create the pattern and the texture for your tree. I place different lines going across the tree bark to show that there are cracks within the wood, that it's an older tree. And that's simply all what those lines are. And I break those lines because it's not all the way fully through the tree. Otherwise, then the tree would be very weak and would fall. This is where I'm showing how simple the line work really is. It's almost like Charlie Brown's sweater, where I'm applying these V-shaped lines, one over the other, or several inside of each other, sort of like the nesting dolls from Russia. And when you do the knot in the tree, you can make the knot go around in this particular pattern. Now I'm going to draw a 2x4 or a block of wood. Now the wood hasn't been cut evenly, so I made the top and the bottom at different angles and different lengths. But I'm applying the same principle here, the same pattern, applying these triangles that you can actually make into any kind of shape that you want. It's almost like the Predator, when he has the thermal vision and the effect that they use. So it's a very simple and easy way to draw the wooden texture. And then it's how you decide you want to render the drawing. I like to use those jagged lines, as I mentioned before, in the tree bark, and this helps create the rough, weathered tree or an older piece of wood with splinters and different things, that it's not a smooth piece of wood. And also you should keep in mind that each tree or piece of wood has a very unique wood grain and pattern to it, sort of like the way our fingerprints are unique to each person. I place the lines going across horizontally to show that there's stress cracks in the piece of wood. Now I'm going to draw a different tree bark. You can draw the tree barks in different ways depending on the pattern that you want to draw on the tree bark. In this particular pattern, I am drawing almost the same look of pattern that you would see when you're playing the classic video game Tetris. Now these are just going to be a bunch of L shapes and a bunch of J shapes lines, a bunch of L shaped lines and J shaped lines. And how you decide you want to place them closer together is going to determine on how old and how many cracks are inside this tree bark. And I'm doing the same thing here with the rendering. I'm shading in the areas that the light isn't hitting, and that's what those lines are. They're the embossed area of the tree bark that it dips inward. It has tiny little canyons, and that's what those darker lines are. And it's totally up to you on how you want to render your illustration. But this is what I found that works for me. It works very quickly, even though you could leave the illustration without the rendering. It still has that look and effect, and a colorist could come in and then apply the color tones in the rendering to help your illustration. But I like for my illustrations to stand on their own, even without color. But you do have to be careful of over-rendering. Sometimes I over-render my illustrations. They don't have to be that far rendered. And you do have to keep in mind that for comic books, you are on a deadline, so the illustrations are simplified. But as an artist, you want to be proud of your work. You want it to be the best work that it could possibly be. And so I always take it a step further and make sure that my illustrations can stand on their own in black and white. And the reason for the artistic intro, where we get a close-up of all the textures and all the different colors and with the film, is so that I can show how interesting things can look if you look at them from a new perspective. And I wanted to show how artsy and beautiful these textures can be, and if we were to stop and take a closer look at them. And now here, I'm going to show you the pattern, how simple it really is to create that look for this older weathered tree bark. And it's simply just shaped almost like a maze, or like the classic video game Tetris that I mentioned before. Very simple lines. They are S shapes, they are J shapes and L shaped lines, and it's how you place the line together that creates the pattern that makes it look like the texture of a weathered tree. Not all textures are simply patterns, but most of them are. Now we're going to move on to the glass texture and how to make it look shiny with just simple lines. So this here is a wine glass. And I have a lot of experience with the wine glass, so I should be able to draw them pretty well. And on the side, I'm showing where there is less light on the glass. and that's what the shadow is. It's really where the less light is. And on the right is my light source. So that line is simply two almost circles, one circle and one sort of a curved rectangle. And that's where the light is hitting the glass. And since the glass is see-through, you do want to keep your rendering very light, very simple on this. Now I'm going to do a drinking glass. And it's the same principle, it's the same approach to it, no matter which glass you're drawing. But you want to keep in mind the shape of the glass, because you want to make sure that your lines contour with the shape. And you can see here where I've placed these simple rectangle highlights on the side, and on the left is the shading where the light is not reflecting as much off the glass. And this is a simple shape. It's just this simple rectangle shape, and you want to make sure that they do contour with the shape of the glass. Now this is the left side where there's less light, so your rendering is black. You fill in basically the same shape that you did with the outline, and you just simply shade it in on the left side where there is no light. When you're drawing weathered textures, I like to draw very quickly when I draw and almost scribble when I draw the weathered texture. First I'm drawing a metal beam is what I'm drawing here, and I'm just doing the simple outline of it. And you could leave the illustration like this, as I mentioned before, and have a colorist come in and do the work, but I enjoy the rendering. I enjoy creating these textures. Textures are actually one of the things that I really enjoy the most out of illustration. And you can see here where I decided to create these sort of angled little lines. I kind of scribbled these little almost half circles, and then on either the top of that half circle or the bottom of that half circle, depending on the texture that is rough, that's rougher, I do these lines, and these lines are inspired by Dave Finch. These are the lines that I've learned to draw from him, and Rudy Nebra has done these lines as well. And by doing these lines and making them thicker at the bottom, at the base, and thinner as they feather out towards the top, it creates the effect that there is much darker texture down at the bottom, and then it lightens up as the light hits further up to the front, because weather texture isn't even. If you saw the reference in the film before where I show the samples, when you look up close, it's not an even surface. It has multi-layers of the surface. So by creating these lines, thicker to thin, you create that illusion. I show these little circles on top of the metal because to show that the metal isn't even. It's got little dents in it. Now this is going to be a beam, a cylinder shape of metal that is weathered. And as you can see, I drew these zigzag kind of lines and half circles, and I draw them very quickly. The quicker that you draw them and the much more loose that you are when drawing them, the better the effect will be. And I'm applying the simple line work again with placing those bleed lines and breaking them up a little here and there, and adding in those little dark circles, which again add in the dents. And I make sure the edge of the cylinder, since it's worn, isn't a straight perfect line, so I freehand that. I didn't use a ruler because a ruler is going to give you too clean of a line. So trying to freehand it as much as you can gives it that rough weathered effect. You want to keep in mind your light source and the shape of the object that you're drawing. You want to make sure that your lines do contour with it and that do follow the form and the shape. So here I'm drawing the pattern and showing how simple it is, and where you place your line work in that pattern is going to help create the illusion of the multi-level weathered surface. And these are all techniques and textures that work for me, things that I've developed and created for myself that help me draw my illustrations and get the look and effect that I want, and to be able to do illustrations quick enough for a monthly comic book. But you don't have to draw necessarily in this style. You can take these rules and apply them to your art style, and it really works with any particular art style that you want to draw in. But the rules are always the same. So you want to make sure to keep in mind your light source and the shape of the object that you're drawing.
Hello, viewer. Can you hear me? Viewer, are you there? I see you have found a hidden question for the Eon Artboard Pack giveaway. In order to qualify for this giveaway, you must be a subscriber to this channel. Once you have found the answer to this question, you must place your answer in the comment with the title of the video and the video segment number, along with your email. Are you ready, viewer? The question is, in what video do I make the following comment? It is also recommended that you mix the ink with blank ink if you want to make it thicker. I will repeat the question. In what video do I make the following comment? It is also recommended that you mix the ink with blank ink if you want to make it thicker. Go now, viewer. Find the answer
and be the winner
of the Eon Artboard Pack giveaway. Go now. Be the first to answer this question. And don't forget to finish watching the end of this video.
Light source and shape are always the key to rendering. Two things you want to keep in mind. Now we're going to draw a wooden stone. This wooden stone has either been shaped by water or weather or rain, wind. It is going to have multi-levels of flat surfaces. It's not going to be one single flat surface. So you want to create angular lines. Keep the grip on your pencil loose, and you want to be light-handed and just draw a bunch of angular lines, lines that sort of curve with a little bit of a jagged edge, somewhat of a triangle that curves into a rectangle, and you want to keep that rhythm going when laying out the foundation, the underdrawing. What I'm shading in are the areas where the light is not hitting this side of the rock. So I'm shading in larger black areas because there are larger, wider, flat areas and angular areas and larger multi-levels to this rock. Now this rock's a bit more smoother, so that's why I'm only shading in the sides of the rock. And I add a few little cracks in there. I do break the line because a crack doesn't go all the way through the rock. It's just somewhat in the rock, and there are different levels to the rock, so some of those lines are just a bit thicker in some areas. And you really just want to have fun with this. Use your imagination. Recall from the experience that you had when you were out looking at different rocks and touching different rocks, and even from using those Google images, they do provide you some information. They are good for reference. But of course, it's always good to be able to add to that visual reference the experience of actually going out and actually touching these rocks, to know what the texture feels like, to get a close-up look at the rock and to see how the light reflects off these shapes of the rock. So when I'm drawing the edge of this rock, I am using angular lines. I am doing somewhat of a sketch technique where I'm not drawing the line as long and smooth. I am taking shorter strokes, shorter, quick little strokes with the pencil, and that gives me a rough edge to this rock, because the rock appears to look smooth on the surface, but it's not completely smooth. There is some texture to it, so that's why I'm drawing the outside lines rough and angular. And then I'm having some fun. I'm adding a few more little cracks here and there, just to bring in some more of the detail and some of the realism, even though I'm drawing in a comic book art style. So I'm putting in little chips into there, little dents. That's what the little circle lines are, similar to the same thing that I did with the weathered metal. And so if we were to draw the edge of a cliff, something that has a bit more of a rough surface to it. And this is going to be the edge of a cliff, and these angular lines down the side are the sides of the cliff to show that it has a bit of a depth to it, that it isn't completely flat. Either it's the edge of a cliff or it's the edge of a canyon, and it may not be that deep. And on top here, what I'm doing is I'm adding in some of the different cracks and some of the little circular little lines that I'm doing are to show that there's little rocks and pebbles and things, or that the earth is really dry and cracked. You can create those two different type of effects, and that's more of what I did here, was creating the illusion that the earth on the flat surface is cracked and dry, and there are some rocks in there. But I'm currently drawing in and shading in the sides of this little canyon, of this canyon edge. And the reason I'm shading them in just a little darker is because it does have multi-levels, and where the edge goes in a little further, that's where the light doesn't catch, and so there's shadow there. And so that's really what why those lines are that way. And so here we come back to the stone, where you can add in different type of line work, going angular, going horizontally, and this will create a bit more of a shadow and a texture on the very top, if you wanted to do that. Now I'm showing how simple the line is when I draw the sides where I shade in on the stone. And they're just a bit of an angular line, just like this, and they're mostly squares and somewhat of a little bit of a triangle and a rectangle, and then I drag the line out thinner where there's less of an edge, and that's really all that the rendering is. It's just these shapes of lines, and it's completely up to you and how you want to create this pattern, how you want to place them next to each other, and that will create the edge look of your stone. And that's just showing the multi-level. And that's really all that is. Very simple. So now I'm going to have fun here drawing some fur. So let's say that there's a wild dog, and this dog, or it could be a wild dog, or a coyote, or a hyena, or something. Let's say this dog is angry at something. It's barking, it's growling, and so the fur is going to spike up on its back. And so I think that's always neat and fun to draw. When you draw the animal and you want to draw them in action, you draw them kind of quick. You keep the energy within the pencil and within the illustration by just going in there and sketching it fairly quickly, fairly rough and loose when you first building and constructing your illustration. And that just keeps the energy inside and helps the action. And you want to remember that the dog isn't completely static. You've caught him in the middle of movement, and you've captured this photograph right in the middle of some kind of action, some kind of movement. And you want to remember that the dog does have weight to him. So he's going to bend his joints. He's going to dip his head. He's going to bend his hind legs. Both his feet may not be on the ground. One will be supporting his weight, and the other could be up, getting ready to move forward at whatever he's going to lunge at. So that's just side notes to keep in there for creating action scenes and movement that I can do a tutorial on in the future. So right now we're going to go back to how I rendered the fur. So with the fur, I do keep triangular lines, almost like what you would see on a seismograph. The lines don't completely stay within the same height. These triangular lines, then some of them curve up and some are lower, and that's kind of what I created on the outside of the fur that spikes up over his back, and some on the side of his jaw. I'm adding a collar to show that this dog is domesticated, even though he's a pretty wild dog. He's pretty angry. And so when I shaded and render the fur, the key thing here is that the shape is actually like the back end of a fork, a utensil, fork that you eat with. And if you look on the back of the fork, or even the back of your hand, you have that square base that is your palm. and it's the back of your palm by your knuckles. And then you have your 4 fingers, not including your thumb, but if you place your thumb inside the bottom of your palm, looking at your hand from behind, and you have your 4 fingers directly up. That creates the look of a fork. Over his shoulder, that's exactly what I've done. I've created this fork, and I've bent the fingers or the blade of the fork in the direction of the contour of his shoulder. And that's really all that this rendering is. It's a bunch of these little forks, the very tip of a fork or the very back end of your hand, with the back end of your palm and knuckles and your 4 fingers directly up or curved. And that's all I'm doing. And then I just take just the 4 fingers and without the base, and I start placing those on top of the previous fork. And as they are nearing the area where there's less light, then that black area becomes thicker. And as it begins to feather out and become exposed to more light, then it's just the little bitty fork ends, and they begin to get thinner and further apart. And that's how you create the shade and the shadow and texture of fur. Now, he has very rough fur, so this works best if you are keeping a rough, quick sketch with this when you're placing your lines down. You don't want to organize them too neatly, but at the same time, you want to have some control over that chaos. I mean, you do want to place them down fairly quickly with a little bit of control, because you do want to control the shape where his muscles are and where his body curves inward. Where the light isn't hitting, that's where it gets thicker, and where the light does hit, then it gets they get lighter and further apart. And because that one paw is further back underneath him, there's going to be less light, so I shaded that in. Underneath his belly, it's going to be darker because the light source is up top. And so underneath, I've rendered that just a little more. And here, I'm going to show you the example of what I meant by the fur. Starting out at the base, where it's a larger square black, and then the little 4 fingers that stick up. So we're going to start with the thicker 4 fingers. And they are sticking up all. So we horizontally place all these fingers down at the bottom, sticking up, and then we stagger the lines above, and the lines begin to slowly, gradually get thinner. And then on the next row, we do the same thing. We stagger them, meaning that they are over the gap between the bottom row, and the lines begin to get thinner, and the lines also are starting to get shorter. So we are starting to create a gradient effect. It's starting to give us the illusion of a gray tone by using line art. And as I continue further up, the lines get shorter and shorter and further apart, still continuing to stagger the lines. And then they're just little dots. And that's all that texture is that's on his fur. It's very simple. It's really not that hard. It's nothing to be intimidated working on. Poor little mouse, all he wanted was a piece of cheese. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you enjoyed this video, I had a lot of fun making this. I enjoyed making the competition for you. And if you guys enjoy this competition, please spread the word with your friends and family about this channel. With the more support that we have, the more views that we have on this channel, the more videos that I can make. Well, thank you so much. Don't forget, be different and ink outside the box.